The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, more commonly known as NATO, is the BLUFOR faction you play as in the ArmA 3 campaign. Formed in April 1949 following the end of World War II, it includes 28 European countries and 2 North American countries. Historically commanded by a U.S. military officer, this position is known as the Supreme Allied Commander. At the time of the East Wind Crisis, the Supreme Allied Commander was General Hans Brecht. Established under the principle of collective defense and of guaranteeing the peace and security of its members through mutual political and military cooperation, once the most formidable joint fighting force in the history of the planet, NATO's worldwide strategic influence is struggling due to constant economic and political turbulence within most of the European member nations and even the United States. Although their economies are weakened and NATO politicians wane in their decisions to continue support of the now 86-year-old defense agreement, NATO still stands as the premier fighting force on Earth in 2035. During the ArmA 3 timeline, NATO troops involved are composed primarily of forces from the United States, specifically the US Army, US Air Force, and US Navy, as well as the British Army and British Special Forces. British Parliament votes to end their contracted deployment to the republics of Altus and Stratus and thus redeploy their main forces home, leaving behind numerous pockets of special forces mixed with US special forces known as the Combat Technology Research Group, or CTRG, which will have their own video dedicated to their lore and backstory. Prior to the events that led to the East Wind campaign, NATO forces known as Task Force Aegis are light and primarily consist of non-combat support personnel remaining behind to close down the remainder of installations that dot the map of Stratus. Their equipment consists of standard MX series rifles in all variants, combat gear and vests, as well as a few remaining HEMTTs, MRAP hunters, and a small air detachment of MH-9 Hummingbirds for quick transportation around the island, all of which were left under the command of Colonel Andrew McKinnon. NATO forces were conducting dual taskings of breaking down the remaining facilities and also training AAF forces to be better prepared for when NATO eventually redeploys. Suddenly and without warning, AAF turns on their NATO counterparts, killing Colonel McKinnon and most of the remaining high-ranking officers left on Stratus, ultimately driving the surviving NATO troops into hiding, where they eventually link up with Captain Scott Miller of CTRG-14 under the guise of being Royal Navy officers. As the campaign progresses, reinforcements eventually arrive in the form of Carrier Strike Group 14, headed by the USS Freedom CVN-83, which was hung up in a budgetary constraint before being released to relieve the beleaguered remnant NATO forces. Under the command of Colonel David Armstrong, callsign Crossroads, the 111th Infantry Division launches from the Freedom and engages in an aggressive campaign on Altus to drive back AAF and CSAT forces. At Armstrong's disposal is the full might of the NATO faction. AH-99 Blackfoots, AMV-7 Marshalls, and M2A1A4 Slammer main battle tanks comprise his main assault force. Supporting these driving forces are multiple batteries of M4 Scorcher and M5 Sandstorm self-propelled artillery that shell enemy positions into dust before the main forces push through. Aerial threats are countered by IFV-6A Cheetahs that swat enemy aircraft from the sky with ease. 2 mechanized brigade combat teams full of battle-hardened US soldiers make up the bulk of the boots on the ground. Colonel Armstrong's forces make short work of both AAF and CSAT forces on Altus, even after a failed initial push to capture the main Altus airbase, which is a critical strategic asset. His forces are aided by Task Force Aegis survivor Corporal Benjamin Carey and his FIA resistance fighters that have come to trust in Carey's leadership against the oppressive AAF. Town by town, NATO forces push the AAF front line back into the northeastern region of Altus, while CSAT forces remain mysteriously standoffish, refusing to openly engage NATO and letting AAF do a majority of the fighting. CSAT almost seems distracted, as if they have an ulterior motive. As NATO forces close in on the village of Ioannina, the last stronghold of the AAF forces, a full, unconditional surrender is sent to NATO from the AAF as CSAT mysteriously begins to withdraw from the conflict, leaving the AAF to fend for itself. Just when the battle seems won, a massive reinforcing CSAT task force enters the AOR, smashing against the exhausted NATO offensive line. Mysteriously, at that exact moment, Captain Scott Miller re-enters the picture after a quick link-up with recently promoted Sergeant Carey. Captain Miller is confronted by Sergeant Carey, who demands to know what exactly is going on and why all the secrecy behind Miller's actions, to which Miller responds,
"We needed more time."
For what? To find this? What is it?
That's classified.
Fuck you, it is!
Carey, I swear, once more and I'll drop you where you stand. Think about it. When was the last time this region experienced tremors like these? There's been at least a dozen in the last few days alone.
What? No, Miller, that's not good enough.
Question time's over.
All units, we've got multiple unknown contacts approaching the northern coast.
Carey is never given hard facts, but has his speculations. A full story on the entire Eastwind incident will be coming up soon in my lore series, but for now, we gather what remains of the NATO forces and attempt to regroup against the onslaught of CSAT reinforcements. The basic NATO unit is the Rifle Squad. These squads vary in size, typically between 8 to 12 men, and consist of 2 fire teams. Normally led by an E6 staff sergeant, squads can sometimes be led by an E5 sergeant that distinguish themselves through enhanced leadership capabilities or through attrition during combat operations where promotions are not able to be administered. A full spread of specialties are included in the squad combat capabilities to include a marksman, anti-tank trooper, a heavy gunner or automatic rifleman, a combat medic, and at least 1 or 2 team leaders, depending on the size of the group. Forming from the basic squad, specialty squads are also available to NATO commanders such as anti-air and anti-armor teams, sniper teams, and assault and weapons squads, as well as special forces recon units for clandestine operations. The command structure is typically held firm across all units. However, operational necessity does sometimes warrant special consideration, like when Corporal Carey came back from Stratus leading guerrilla fighters. He retained his NATO rank but was held at arm's length by higher headquarters until the facts from the botched withdrawal came to light. Armored and mechanized units also follow a similar command structure to the infantry squad, typically being led by a lieutenant or captain depending on the composition of the unit. Responsible for a few $1 million in equipment, the commander oversees multiple NCOs and junior enlisted while carrying out deployed operations. This can range from armed convoy escort, direct assault missions, and frontline defense operations. Armor and mechanized units form the iron fist that NATO uses to punch through entrenched positions, but are completely vulnerable without infantry support and thus hardly ever operate alone. Many armored units include embedded anti-air cheetahs to keep the skies clear of enemy attack helicopters and fast-moving close air support fighters, a tank commander's worst nightmare during an operation. Long-range fire support elements in the shape of M4 Scorcher and M5 Sandstorms are also found within the mechanized unit, but are typically reserved well behind the front line to ensure the safety and reach of the heavy weapons. Because if the big guns are too close to the front line, then they're rendered virtually useless and thus must be kept back from the direct action. Fire support elements typically consist of 2 to 4 vehicles per squad and act as a singular unit that is capable of bringing its heavy firepower to bear on one or multiple targets during combined operations and are some of the most devastating weapons available to deployed NATO commanders. The air wings are less traditional, consisting of primarily commissioned officers and enlisted aircrew, as well as enlisted maintenance personnel that keep the aircraft operational during both pre- and post-flight operations. Usually commanded by a major or colonel, air support will typically run as 2 or 4 ship elements, but rarely more than that. Close air support provided by A164 wipeouts are some of the most devastating direct fire supports a ground commander can call in and help bolster ground forces' morale as they watch the enemy flee multiple gun and rocket runs. Gunship support is also available via AH-99 Blackfoots and light close air support through AH-9 Pawnees that use miniguns and rockets during coordinated strafing runs. Finally, the support elements that keep forward operating bases in action and troops supplied come in the shape of HEMTT supply trucks in multiple variants, as well as CH-67 Hurons for both troop transport and light airlift capabilities. These vehicle sections are typically run by a staff sergeant during operational activities and commanded by a seasoned lieutenant or a young captain for administrative purposes. The airborne support elements are usually commanded by a seasoned captain or major and are the lifeblood of any combat deployment. Once the ammunition and fuel stops, the fight is lost, so it is imperative that the support elements make it through to the many decentralized locations scattered throughout the AOR. NATO is a well-oiled machine capable of advanced combined arms operations thanks to the strong backing of many developed countries. Though they have suffered minor defeats facing overwhelming CSAT forces in the South China Sea, NATO stands as the dominant fighting force in the Armaverse and continues to project power around the globe. Well guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed episode 2 of my ArmA 3 lore series. ArmA 3 has a lot of interesting backstory and mystery behind the events that take place, and I'd like to help put more videos out about the expansive lore of one of the best games of our generation. If you want me to continue to produce lore videos like this, please let me know in the comments below. I'd like to take a second to thank my incredible patrons whose gracious support has kept me going, so thank you guys so very much for all your continued support. I'd also like to thank you, the viewer, for watching, liking, commenting, and engaging with me on your thoughts and love for ArmA 3. Thank you all again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.